The break room fell silent when Cole Bridwell walked in. Scrubs too loose on his broad shoulders, lunch bag packed by a 7-year-old's hands, crayon hearts drawn on the brown paper. "Look at him," someone whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. From whatever he was to wiping bedpans. The laughter came easy, careless. They saw the calloused hands fumbling with paperwork, the humble apartment address on his employee file, the way he flinched when they called him the male nurse. Nobody asked about the scars hidden beneath his sleeves. Nobody noticed how his eyes swept every room like he was calculating exits. And nobody, not a single soul in that hospital, could have predicted what would happen when a Navy helicopter descended onto their parking lot and a uniformed officer stepped out asking for Sergeant Bridwell by name. The man they mocked was about to become the only person who could save lives that day. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital hummed their eternal song as Cole Bridwell pushed through the staff entrance at 5:45 in the morning. His boots, old combat boots he'd never quite managed to replace, squeaked against the freshly mopped linoleum. The smell of industrial cleaner mixed with that particular hospital scent that never quite left your nostrils, no matter how many years passed. He carried a worn leather bag over one shoulder and clutched a brown paper lunch sack in his other hand, the one decorated with crayon hearts and a stick figure drawing of a man in blue scrubs, holding hands with a smaller figure in a purple dress. Penny had insisted on drawing it the night before, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked. "So you won't be lonely, Daddy," she'd said, and Cole had felt something crack open in his chest, the way it always did when his daughter showed him a kindness he wasn't sure he deserved. The nurse's station was already buzzing with the early shift when Cole arrived to clock in. 3 women in matching teal scrubs looked up simultaneously, their conversation dying mid-sentence. He recognized the look had been seeing it every day for the past 3 weeks since he'd started at Mercy General. It was the look people gave you when they couldn't quite figure out where you fit in their carefully organized world. A man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, with hands that looked more suited to construction work than checking vitals and adjusting IV drips. He nodded politely to the group and reached for the time clock, feeling their eyes trace the movement of his back, probably noting how the scrub top pulled tight across his shoulders, how out of place he looked among the slender female nurses who made up most of the staff. "Morning, Bridwell," said one of the nurses, a blonde woman named Tammy, whose smile never quite reached her eyes. "Ready for another exciting day of bedpan duty." The other 2 snickered behind their coffee cups, and Cole felt the familiar heat creep up his neck. He'd learned long ago to let comments like that roll off to not rise to bait that was designed to make him react. So he simply nodded, again, mumbled something about being happy to help wherever needed, and headed toward the locker room to stow his belongings. Behind him, he heard Tammy's voice carry just a little too clearly. Honestly, what kind of man becomes a nurse must have washed out of something else. The laughter that followed was sharp and dismissive, and Cole kept walking his jaw tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The locker room was mercifully empty at this hour. Cole opened his assigned locker number 47 bottom row, because of course they'd given him the least convenient spot, and carefully placed Penny's lunch bag art on the inside of the door. He'd taped up a photo there too, one of him and Penny at the county fair last summer, both of them grinning with cotton candy stuck to their faces. She was 7 now, all gangly limbs and missing front teeth, and questions that he never quite knew how to answer. "Why don't I have a mommy like the other kids?" she'd asked just last week, and Cole had held her close and told her the truth as gently as he could, that her mother had loved her very much, but hadn't been strong enough to stay, that sometimes people left, not because of anything you did wrong, but because of battles they were fighting inside themselves that nobody else could see. Penny had nodded solemnly, then asked if she could have ice cream for dinner. He'd said yes, because what else could he do? Cole pulled on a fresh scrub top and checked his reflection in the small mirror mounted on the wall. The face that looked back at him was weathered beyond its 38 years lines. Around the eyes, a jaw that had been broken twice. A nose that had been reset more times than he cared to remember. There were scars, too, though most of them were hidden beneath the fabric of his clothes. A puckered line across his left shoulder, where shrapnel had torn through muscle and sinew. A web of burn marks on his right forearm from an IED that had turned a transport vehicle into a furnace. And deeper scars, the kind that didn't show on the surface, the kind that woke him at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. 8 years as a Navy SEAL combat medic had left their marks on his body and his mind, in ways that civilian life was only beginning to reveal. He'd thought he was prepared for anything. He hadn't been prepared for this, for the slow erosion of dignity that came from being looked at, like he was less than like his choice to care for the sick, and hurting somehow made him weak. His shift officially began at 6, and by 6:15, Cole was already deep in the trenches of morning rounds. Mercy General was a small regional hospital, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and gossip traveled faster than any official memo. His patients that day included an elderly man recovering from hip surgery, a teenage girl with a broken leg from a skateboarding accident, and a middle-aged woman receiving chemotherapy, who reminded Cole painfully of his own mother, gone now 10 years from the same disease. He moved between rooms with quiet efficiency, checking vitals, adjusting medications, answering call buttons that the other nurses seemed too busy to reach. He'd noticed that pattern early on, how the difficult patients, the ones who complained or needed extra attention, somehow always ended up on his rotation. The unspoken hierarchy of the nursing staff had placed him firmly at the bottom, and every menial task that nobody else wanted fell to him by default. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Dr. Sloane Carver made her first appearance on the floor. Cole had heard about her before he'd actually met her, the head of emergency medicine, a woman with a reputation for brilliance, and an even stronger reputation for not suffering fools. She was tall, with dark hair, pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and eyes the color of strong coffee, sharp and assessing. She moved through the hallway like she owned it, which in many ways she did, and the other staff members seemed to part before her like waves before a ship's prow. Cole was adjusting the IV line on Mr. Patterson, his hip surgery patient, when Dr. Carver stopped in the doorway, clipboard in hand, her gaze sweeping over the room before landing on him with an intensity that made him feel suddenly exposed. "You're the new one," she said. It wasn't a question. "Bridwell, right, the nurse everyone's been talking about." Cole straightened, meeting her eyes steadily despite the flutter of unease in his chest. "Yes, ma'am. Cole Bridwell." He waited for the comment he knew was coming, the joke about his gender, or his background, or whatever rumor had made its way to the doctor's ears. But Dr. Carver just studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable before glancing down at her clipboard. "Mr. Patterson's numbers look good. Better than they did yesterday, actually. You've been handling his care." Cole nodded. "Just following the treatment plan, ma'am. He responded well to the adjusted pain management protocol." "Doctor." Carver's eyebrows rose slightly, and something flickered in her gaze that might have been surprise or might have been reassessment. "I see," she said. And then she was gone, moving on to the next room, leaving Cole to wonder what exactly had just passed between them. The rest of the morning crawled by in the way that hospital mornings do, each minute, stretching into an hour when you're on your feet and every muscle in your body is screaming for rest. Cole took his lunch break at 12:30, retreating to a quiet corner of the break room with Penny's decorated bag and the peanut butter sandwich he'd made at 4 a.m. The other nurses were clustered at the main table, their conversation animated and exclusive, a clear boundary drawn between them and the outsider eating alone by the window. Cole didn't mind the solitude, had learned to appreciate it, actually, during years of deployments, where a moment of peace was a luxury rarely afforded. He thought about Penny sitting in her second-grade classroom right now, probably fidgeting through math lessons and counting the minutes until recess. She'd been struggling lately, coming home with notes from her teacher about distraction and incomplete assignments. Cole knew the source of it without having to ask. Kids could be cruel, and the fact that Penny's father was a nurse instead of having some more traditionally masculine job had not gone unnoticed by her classmates. He was just finishing his sandwich when his phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Holloway, the elderly neighbor who watched Penny after school until Cole's shift ended. P having a rough day. Got into an argument with some kids at lunch. She's okay, but wanted you to know. Cole stared at the message, his appetite suddenly gone, guilt settling in his stomach like a stone. He should be there. He should be the one picking her up from school, helping her with homework, being present for all the small moments that made up a childhood. Instead, he was here wiping down gurneys and enduring whispered insults because this job, with its steady paycheck and health insurance, was the only thing standing between his daughter and the kind of instability that had marked his own childhood. The choice between being there and providing for her was a false choice. Really, both were forms of love, both were necessary, but neither felt like enough. The afternoon brought a code blue that would change everything, though Cole didn't know it yet when the alarm sounded at 2:47. He was in the supply room restocking gauze and antiseptic when the overhead speaker crackled to life with that phrase that still sent adrenaline spiking through his veins, no matter how many times he heard it. He moved on instinct, years of training, overriding conscious thought, his feet carrying him toward the emergency room, before his mind had fully processed what was happening. The scene that greeted him was chaos, a young man on a gurney, maybe 25 blood soaking through the makeshift bandages wrapped around his torso, his face pale and his eyes rolling back in his head. 3 nurses were already there, moving with the controlled panic that came from experience, but their movements were hesitant, uncertain, and Cole could see immediately what they were missing. He's got a tension pneumothorax, Cole said, pushing forward, without thinking about protocols or hierarchy. Left side, we need to decompress now, or we're going to lose him. Dr. Carver appeared at his shoulder, her face set in grim concentration. How can you tell? She demanded, and Cole pointed to the patient's neck, to the trachea that was visibly shifting to the right, to the distended jugular veins that spoke of a heart being crushed by pressure it was never meant to bear. Tracheal deviation, JVD, absent breath, sounds on the left. I've seen this before. He didn't elaborate on where or how, didn't mention the battlefield, or the sand, or the way a human body looked when it was torn open by forces beyond imagination. But Dr. Carver must have seen something in his eyes, some knowledge that went beyond textbook learning, because she nodded once, sharply, and said, "Do it." Cole moved without hesitation. His hands found the needle, the alcohol swab, the precise spot between the second and third rib, where the trapped air was turning the patient's chest into a pressurized tomb. He'd done this procedure dozens of times, under far worse conditions in the back of moving vehicles, under enemy fire, with nothing but a field kit, and his own 2 hands standing between a wounded brother and the void. Here, in this clean hospital, with its sterile equipment and its buzzing fluorescent lights, it was almost easy. The needle slid in, there was a rush of escaping air, and the young man on the gurney gasped his first full breath in what must have felt like an eternity. The whole thing took less than 30 seconds. The silence that followed lasted much longer, and Cole became gradually aware that every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on him. The nurses who had mocked him that morning, the orderlies who had barely acknowledged his existence, and Dr. Sloane Carver, whose expression had shifted into something that looked almost like respect. "Where did you learn to do that?" Dr. Carver asked, her voice quiet enough that only Cole could hear. He met her gaze, weighing how much truth to offer, how much of his past to reveal to this woman who was still essentially a stranger. "The Navy," he said finally. "I was a medic. Saw a lot of things that needed fixing fast." He didn't say what branch, didn't mention the trident pin that was locked away in a box in his closet, along with medals he'd never wear and memories he'd never share. Dr. Carver nodded slowly, something shifting behind her eyes, a question forming that she didn't quite voice. "Well," she said. "Instead, you just saved that man's life, Bridwell. That's not nothing." Cole looked down at his hands, at the blood that was already drying on his fingers, at the slight tremor that came not from fear, but from the adrenaline come-down he knew so well. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he said, and he turned away before she could see anything else in his face. The news of what happened in the ER spread through Mercy General faster than a wildfire through dry brush. By the end of his shift, Cole had noticed a subtle change in the way people looked at him, still curious, still uncertain, but with something new mixed in a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps there was more to the quiet male nurse than met the eye. Tammy and her friends were notably silent when he passed the nurse's station on his way out, their whispered conversations dying away as he approached. Cole didn't acknowledge the shift, didn't gloat or posture, or do any of the things that might have felt satisfying in the moment. He simply clocked out, retrieved Penny's lunch bag from his locker, and walked to his truck in the gathering dusk. His mind already moving ahead to the evening's responsibilities dinner to make homework, to supervise a little girl who needed to know that her father loved her, even when the world seemed determined to make everything harder than it needed to be. Mrs. Holloway met him at the door of her apartment, her lined face creased with concern. "She's been quiet all afternoon," she said in a low voice. "Wouldn't tell me what happened, but I could see she'd been crying." Cole thanked her, pressed a 20 into her hand that she tried to refuse, and let himself into his own apartment across the hall. The space was small, a living room that doubled as a dining area, a tiny kitchen, 2 bedrooms barely big enough to hold their beds. But it was theirs, paid for, with honest work. And it was safe and warm and full of Penny's drawings, taped to every available surface. He found his daughter on her bed, curled around a stuffed elephant that had been her constant companion since infancy, her face turned toward the wall. Cole sat on the edge of the mattress, not touching her, yet just letting her know he was there. "Hey, Pen," he said softly. "Rough day." She didn't answer at first, her small shoulders hitching with what might have been suppressed sobs. Then, in a voice that broke his heart, "They said you're not a real man because you're a nurse. They said nurses are for girls, and that means I don't have a real daddy." Cole felt his jaw tighten, felt the old familiar anger rise up from somewhere deep in his core, not at his daughter, never at her, but at a world that taught children to be cruel before it taught them to be kind. He reached out and placed his hand gently on her back, feeling the warmth of her through her purple t-shirt, feeling the rapid flutter of her breathing. "Can I tell you something, sweetheart?" he asked, and when she nodded, he continued. "The bravest people I ever knew were the ones who took care of others when they were hurt. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. What matters is that when someone needs help, you're there. That's what real strength looks like." Penny rolled over, then her face blotchy with tears. Her eyes, her mother's eyes, dark and deep and full of feelings. She didn't yet have words for searching his face for reassurance. "But why do they say mean things?" she asked, and Cole gathered her into his arms, holding her the way he'd held her when she was a baby, before he knew how to be a father, before he understood that love could be both the most natural thing in the world and the most terrifying. "Because they don't understand yet," he said. "Sometimes people are scared of things that are different, and when they're scared, they try to make other people feel small. But you don't have to let them make you feel small, Penny. You know who your daddy is. You know what he does. And I know who you are, the bravest, kindest, most wonderful girl in the whole world. That's what matters. She clung to him for a long time, her tears soaking into his scrub top, and Cole held her and thought about all the battles he'd fought, all the enemies he'd faced, and how none of them had prepared him for the war of raising a child alone, in a world that seemed determined to break you down. The weeks that followed brought small changes, incremental shifts in the landscape of Cole's life at Mercy General. Word of his performance during the Code Blue had spread beyond the nursing staff to the broader hospital community, and he began to notice a difference in how the doctors treated him. A nod of acknowledgement. Here, a question about his opinion. There, a gradual recognition that perhaps his experience went deeper than his job title suggested. Dr. Carver, in particular, seemed to have taken an interest in him, stopping by during rounds to check on his patients, asking questions that probed gently at the borders of his past, without demanding entry. Cole found himself looking forward to these brief interactions, to the sharp intelligence in her eyes, and the rare flashes of warmth that broke through her professional exterior. She was guarded. He could see that carrying her own burdens beneath the armor of her white coat, and he recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone who had learned to survive by building walls. One evening, after a particularly difficult shift that had included a pediatric trauma and a death that had hit closer to home than Cole wanted to admit, Dr. Carver found him on the roof of the hospital, sitting on a concrete ledge with his face turned toward the setting sun. She didn't say anything at first, just settled beside him with a respectful distance between them, her own gaze fixed on the horizon, where orange bled into purple, bled into the deepening blue of approaching night. "It's the kids," she said finally. "That's what gets me, too. Adults, you can compartmentalize. They've lived their lives, made their choices. But children," she trailed off, and Cole nodded, understanding completely. "My daughter's 7. He said the words coming out before he could think to stop them. "Every time I see a kid come through those doors, I see her. I think about what it would feel like to be on the other side of that equation." Dr. Carver looked at him, then really looked at him, and something in her expression softened. "You were military," she said. It wasn't a question. "I can tell by the way you carry yourself, the way you move in a crisis." Cole was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth to offer. "Navy," he said, finally. 8 years. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push, and something unspoken passed between them in the gathering dark, an understanding that some wounds were too deep for casual conversation, but that perhaps with time they might be shared. The incident that would change everything happened on a Tuesday in late October, 3 months after Cole had started at Mercy General. The morning had been unremarkable routine rounds, a few new admissions, the steady rhythm of hospital life that had become almost familiar. Cole was in the break room eating an early lunch when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a low thudding that seemed to vibrate through the walls and floor. He was on his feet before the second beat, moving toward the window, his body reacting to stimuli that his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. What he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. A Navy helicopter, black and sleek and unmistakable, was descending into the hospital parking lot, its rotors churning the air into a frenzy of dust and debris. People were scattering, patients in wheelchairs being hurried away from windows. Staff members pressing their faces to the glass with expressions of shock and confusion. But Cole didn't move. He stood rooted in place, watching the aircraft touch down, watching the door slide open, watching a figure in dress whites step out into the chaos with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. He knew with a certainty that settled in his bones like ice that they had come for him. The officer who entered the hospital was a commander, his uniform crisp, and his face set in grim determination. He moved through the crowd like a knife through water, his eyes scanning faces until they landed on Cole with a recognition that needed no introduction. "Sergeant Bridwell," he said, and the title, a title Cole hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years, cut through the ambient noise like a gunshot. "I'm Commander Wells. We need you. Cole was aware of the silence spreading outward from their confrontation, of the eyes turning toward him, of the questions forming on faces that had never seen him as anything more than the odd male nurse who kept to himself. He thought about Penny, about the life he'd built here, about the careful distance he'd maintained from his former identity. And then he looked at Commander Wells's face, saw the barely contained desperation there, and knew that whatever had brought the Navy to his door was not something he could turn away from. "What's happened?" Cole asked, his voice steady despite the storm building in his chest. Commander Wells glanced around at the gathered crowd, clearly uncomfortable with the audience, but knowing that time was a luxury they didn't have. "There's a situation, classified mostly, but what I can tell you is that we have personnel in critical condition, and no one qualified to treat them. Not the way you can." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was lower, meant only for Cole's ears. "Frogman 4 is down. Multiple casualties. They're asking for you by name, Bridwell. They're asking for Ghost Doc." The call sign hit Cole like a physical blow, a name he'd buried, along with so much else from his former life. Ghost Doc, the medic, who could materialize out of nowhere, patch you up under fire, and disappear before the enemy knew what had happened. The man who had saved more lives than anyone bothered to count, because in the SEALs, you didn't keep score. You just kept breathing. The break room had emptied of all but a handful of people, but among those who remained was Dr. Sloane Carver. Her face pale, her eyes fixed on Cole with an expression that combined shock and something that looked almost like vindication. "You were a SEAL," she said, and it wasn't a question. "A combat medic. That's where you learn to decompress a pneumothorax by touch alone." Cole met her gaze, feeling the weight of his secret lifting, even as the reality of the moment pressed down on him. "Yes," he said simply. "For 8 years, 15 deployments, 43 confirmed combat operations." The numbers fell from his lips like stones into still water, each one creating ripples that would spread far beyond this room. He saw Tammy standing near the door, her face drained of color, her earlier mockery replaced by something that might have been shame. He saw the orderlies exchanging glances, recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the quiet man who emptied bedpans without complaint. And he saw Commander Wells, waiting with barely contained impatience, the clock ticking on lives that hung in the balance. "I have a daughter," Cole said. Finally, the words directed at no one and everyone. "She's 7 years old. She's waiting for me to come home." Commander Wells nodded, and there was genuine understanding in his eyes, the kind that came from knowing the weight of impossible choices. "We'll have you back in 48 hours max. A transport is standing by. But Bridwell, Cole, those men out there, they're bleeding out in a location I can't even name. The field medics are doing what they can, but they need someone who's been where they are, who knows what they're facing. They need Ghost Doc." Cole closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids, he saw faces. Brothers in arms, some living, some dead, all of them bound to him by bonds stronger than blood. He thought about what he'd told Penny about real strength being the willingness to help when someone needed it. He thought about the choice between being there and doing what was necessary. And when he opened his eyes, his decision was already made. "Let me make a phone call," he said. "I need to tell my daughter I'll be late." The next 48 hours existed outside of normal time, in that compressed and expanded reality that Cole remembered from his years in the field. He spoke to Penny from the helicopter, trying to explain, without explaining, promising her ice cream and a movie marathon. When he got back, hearing the fear in her small voice and feeling it tear at his heart. Mrs. Holloway agreed to stay with her, bless her soul. And Dr. Carver, who had insisted on walking him to the helicopter, pressed a piece of paper into his hand, with her personal number on it. "In case you need someone to check on her," she said. and Cole saw something in her eyes that went beyond professional concern, that hinted at possibilities he couldn't afford to contemplate just yet. Then the door closed, and the helicopter rose, and the world below fell away, and Cole Bridwell became Ghost Doc once more. His hand steady and his mind clear, and his heart locked away in a compartment he'd built specifically for moments like this. The details of the mission were classified, locked behind walls of secrecy that Cole would never breach, but what he could know was enough. A SEAL team had been ambushed. Multiple casualties with complex trauma. Standard medevac wasn't possible due to the operational environment. They needed someone who could operate under fire, who could make miracles happen with limited supplies and unlimited pressure, who could keep men alive long enough to get them to proper care. Cole did what he'd always done. He worked. Through the night and into the next day, through conditions that would have broken lesser men, through moments when death seemed inevitable, and he refused to accept it. He didn't think about Mercy General, or the nurses who had mocked him, or the small apartment where his daughter's drawings covered the walls. He thought only about the next suture, the next tourniquet, the next breath that meant someone was still fighting. When it was over, when the last of the wounded had been stabilized and transported, Cole found himself sitting on the edge of a transport aircraft, with blood drying on his hands and exhaustion pulling at every fiber of his being. 3 men who should have died were going to live. 2 more had injuries that would end their careers, but not their lives. It wasn't a perfect outcome. It never was. Not in this line of work, but it was something. It was enough. Commander Wells appeared beside him, holding out a bottle of water that Cole accepted, with hands that were finally beginning to shake. "You could come back, you know," the commander said. "The teams would take you in a heartbeat. Hell, they'd fight over you." Cole drank deeply, feeling the cool water trace a path down his parched throat, thinking about what that offer meant. He could return to the life he'd known, the brotherhood that had defined his existence for nearly a decade. The clarity of purpose that came from serving something larger than himself. It was tempting. It was more tempting than he wanted to admit. "I have a daughter," he said again, and this time the words carried a different weight. "She needs her father. Not a hero, not a legend, not a ghost. Just a dad who comes home every night and helps with homework and burns pancakes on Saturday mornings." Commander Wells was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been emotion. "She's lucky to have you, Bridwell. Those boys in there, they'll tell stories about what you did for the rest of their lives. But being a father, being present for your kid, that's a different kind of courage. Maybe the harder kind." Cole nodded, and something settled in his chest, a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He'd made his choice years ago when he'd walked away from the teams to raise Penny alone. Today had been an exception, a moment when 2 worlds collided, and he'd been the bridge between them. But his place was in that small apartment, with the crayon-decorated walls, with the little girl who believed her daddy was strong because he took care of people, not because he could kill. That was the man he wanted to be. That was the man he would continue becoming. The helicopter touched down at Mercy General 36 hours after it had departed, and Cole emerged into an afternoon sunlight that felt like redemption. A small crowd had gathered. Word traveled fast, apparently even faster than classified information was supposed to move, and among the faces watching him walk across the parking lot, he spotted several that had looked at him very differently just 2 days before. Tammy was there, her eyes wet, her hand covering her mouth. The orderlies who had laughed at his expense were standing in stunned silence. And at the front of the group, her white coat pristine against the backdrop of the ordinary, was Dr. Sloane Carver, with a 7-year-old girl clutching her hand. Cole's heart clenched at the sight of Penny, at the way she broke free and ran toward him, her legs pumping and her arms outstretched, and he dropped to his knees and caught her and held her, the way he'd been dreaming of holding her for 36 hours straight. "Daddy," she whispered into his neck, "the doctor lady told me you were helping people who got hurt really bad. She said you were a hero." Cole looked over his daughter's head at Sloane Carver, at the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, at the warmth in her eyes that promised conversations yet to come. "I'm not a hero, sweetheart," he said, but Penny pulled back and fixed him with a look that was far too wise for her 7 years. "Yes, you are," she said firmly. "You're a nurse. You help people. That's what heroes do." And Cole laughed, then the first real laugh he'd managed in days, feeling something crack open in his chest that wasn't grief or pain, but joy, simple and unexpected and overwhelming. He stood lifting Penny with him and turned to face the crowd that had gathered his co-workers, his doubters, the people who had judged him without knowing him. He could have said something triumphant, something that rubbed their faces in their assumptions. Instead, he simply nodded a quiet acknowledgement that required no elaboration and began walking toward the hospital entrance. Dr. Carver fell into step beside him, and Penny, apparently deciding that this woman was acceptable, reached out and grabbed her hand too, so that the three of them walked together like a strange little family unit. "The board wants to talk to you," Sloane said quietly. "There's been some discussion about opportunities, leadership positions, things that might be a better use of your skills." Cole considered this, turning it over in his mind, the way he might examine a piece of equipment to see how it worked. "I appreciate that," he said finally. "But I became a nurse because I wanted to help people directly, one at a time, in the moments when they need it most. I'm not sure I want to give that up for meetings and paperwork." Sloane nodded, and there was approval in her expression, maybe even admiration. "I figured you'd say that, but the offer stands." "And Cole," she waited until he looked at her, "I'm glad you came back." The following Monday, Cole returned to work at Mercy General, taking his place in the rhythm of hospital life, as if the extraordinary events of the previous week had been just a strange dream. But everything had changed, even if the surface looked the same. The whispers that followed him now were different, curious rather than cruel, respectful rather than dismissive. Patients asked to be assigned to him, specifically having heard about the nurse, who used to be a SEAL, who had saved lives in circumstances they could barely imagine. His co-workers treated him as an equal, sometimes even as an authority seeking his opinion on cases that would have been beneath his notice before. And Tammy the nurse, who had led the mockery that first morning, approached him in the break room with tears in her eyes and an apology that Cole accepted with grace, understanding that people could change. That judgment was easy, but redemption was possible. Penny, too, had found her footing. The other children at school had heard some version of the story, a garbled, kid-friendly account of the helicopter and the hero nurse who turned out to be a secret soldier, and suddenly her father's profession was no longer a source of shame, but of wonder. She came home with invitations to birthday parties she'd never received before, with stories of classmates who wanted to know more about what nurses actually did, with a new pride in her voice when she talked about her dad. Cole knew that hero worship was a fragile foundation for respect, that true acceptance would need to be built on something more substantial. But for now, it was enough. His daughter held her head high, and that was worth more than any medal or commendation. As for Dr. Sloane Carver, the relationship that had begun with suspicion and curiosity slowly evolved into something deeper. They started with coffee in the hospital cafeteria, moved to occasional dinners at the diner. Down the street, graduated to weekends where Sloane would join Cole and Penny for trips to the park or the museum or the ice cream shop that had become their Saturday ritual. Sloane was guarded. Cole discovered carrying her own wounds from a past. She revealed only in fragments a marriage that had ended badly, a career path chosen in part to escape expectations she'd never wanted to meet. She and Penny took to each other with a naturalness that surprised everyone, and Cole found himself imagining a future he'd long since given up on a family unit. Whole and complete, built not from obligation, but from choice. On a cool evening in early December, 6 months after the helicopter had first landed in the Mercy General parking lot, Cole sat on his couch with Penny asleep against his shoulder and Sloane curled on his other side, a movie playing unwatched on the television. The apartment was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of breathing and the distant hum of the city outside. He thought about the journey that had brought him here from the battlefields of places he could never name to the hospital corridors, where different battles were fought, from the loneliness of single parenthood to this moment of peace with people who saw him for who he truly was. He'd been mocked for being a nurse, dismissed as less than judged for choices that other people couldn't understand. And he'd proven himself, not through violence or aggression, but through competence and compassion, through showing up day after day and doing the hard work that needed to be done. That was the real victory. Not the dramatic rescue, not the helicopter, and the heroics, but this a quiet evening at home. A daughter who knew she was loved, a future that looked brighter than the past. Penny stirred against his shoulder, her eyes fluttering open for just a moment before closing again. "Love you, Daddy," she mumbled, and Cole pressed a kiss to the top of her head, feeling his heart expand to hold the weight of that simple declaration. "Love you too, Pen," he whispered, "always and forever." And as the night deepened around them, as Sloane's hand found his in the darkness, as his daughter's breathing settled into the rhythm of untroubled sleep, Bridwell nurse, father, former SEAL survivor, allowed himself to believe that the best chapters of his story were still ahead. The man they had mocked had found his place. The ghost had finally come home.